In the Egyptian desert, sealed jars were found buried in the sand. Inside them were ancient texts. Those texts described a creator figure, not as the highest god, but as something lower, flawed, or blind. So the first question is this: what exactly were those writers trying to warn people about? What's documented is this: we can follow surviving manuscripts, later translations, and comparative scholarship, and separate recorded texts from modern internet mythology. This story does not begin with a viral clip or a meme about a glitch in reality. It begins with ancient philosophical writing, religious debate, and texts that survived by chance. Now, if we want to understand why the word Demiurge still appears in modern videos, we have to start with the oldest documented use of the idea. In classical Greek philosophy, the term Demiurge appears as a maker or craftsman figure, especially in Plato's Timaeus. There, the figure orders the cosmos, rather than acting as an evil ruler. That's important, because the later, darker version of the Demiurge did not appear in the same form there, but the record shows the idea changes dramatically in later Gnostic traditions. In several Gnostic writings, the physical world is described as incomplete, distorted, or spiritually limited, and a lower creator figure is blamed for that condition. According to surviving texts and later commentary, some groups describe this figure as ignorant. Others described it as arrogant or deceptive. That brings us to the first documented gap. Gnosticism was never one single movement with one single doctrine, so there is no one official version of the Demiurge story. Different communities wrote different texts, and many of those texts were lost, attacked, or preserved only in fragments. Here's the problem. For centuries, much of what people knew about Gnostics came from critics, not from Gnostics speaking in their own voices. That changed in a major way. The Nag Hammadi texts were discovered in Egypt in the mid-1940s, and researchers gained direct access to many early writings linked to Gnostic thought. Those manuscripts did not prove any cosmic prison theory as fact, but they did document sophisticated ancient systems about illusion, ignorance, and spiritual awakening. So the next question is, why does this ancient material feel so modern to so many viewers now? Part of the answer is documented social context. Modern audiences live inside algorithmic feeds, edited realities, and filtered information systems. So older metaphors about illusion can feel newly relevant. Researchers in media studies and technology ethics have repeatedly noted something similar. Recommendation systems can reinforce prior beliefs, narrow exposure, and create feedback loops. That does not prove a hidden metaphysical ruler, but it does show how people can experience a practical version of manufactured reality. Now, before we jump into theories, we need to separate three layers that are often blended together online. The first layer is historical record. What ancient texts actually say, who wrote them, and how scholars interpret them. The second layer is scientific speculation, including simulation theory, information-based models, and unresolved questions in physics. The third layer is modern storytelling, where films, internet clips, and spiritual language mix everything into one dramatic narrative. When those layers get merged, viewers can mistake a metaphor for a measurement, or a hypothesis for a verified conclusion. So let's examine the first major theory carefully and test it against what the record supports. One theory suggests the Demiurge is a literal metaphysical being that created the physical universe as a prison for consciousness. Why this sounds strong is clear. First, multiple Gnostic texts describe a lower creator in direct and forceful language, so the idea has a real historical backbone. Second, the theory resonates emotionally. Many people experience suffering, injustice, and disorder, and a flawed creator feels like an explanation for a broken world. Third, the theory gains cultural power. Modern films and online communities provide vivid imagery, so the concept becomes easy to imagine and retell. But the documented record does not confirm a literal cosmic jailer, and the texts vary by community, symbolism, and theological purpose, which limits any single definitive reading. So that's plausible, but not verified. Now, a second theory takes a different path. It treats the Demiurge as a psychological or symbolic model, rather than a literal entity. One theory suggests the Demiurge represents human ignorance, ego, and the mind's tendency to mistake a partial view for the whole truth. Why this sounds strong is that, first, many ancient spiritual traditions use personified figures to describe inner states, not only external beings. Second, this interpretation fits documented patterns in cognitive science and psychology. Perception is filtered, biased, and shaped by prior expectations. Third, it explains why the Demiurge idea keeps resurfacing across different eras. Because the human struggle with illusion, control, and identity keeps returning. But the record does not confirm that all ancient authors meant it only as metaphor, and some texts appear to make cosmological claims, not just inner psychology. So that's plausible, but not verified. That brings us to the third theory, the one most often linked to modern physics and internet culture. One theory suggests ancient Demiurge narratives and modern simulation theory describe the same reality in different languages. Why this sounds strong is that, first, both frameworks question whether ordinary sensory experience reveals the deepest level of reality. Second, both create a layered model, where what we perceive may be a limited interface, rather than the full system. Third, unresolved questions in physics leave conceptual room for speculative models, especially around quantum interpretation and the nature of space-time. And that captures public imagination. But the record does not confirm a direct line from ancient Gnostic cosmology to simulation models, and no peer-reviewed result has verified that our universe is an engineered simulation. So that's plausible, but not verified. Now, let's return to the documented timeline, because this is where the mystery becomes more useful than the mythology. Ancient philosophers asked what orders the cosmos, and whether matter and form are the same thing. Those questions entered later religious debates. Early Christian-era communities developed competing views about creation, authority, and salvation. And some of those views produced the Demiurge concept in a sharper form. Later church writers argued against those movements, while preserving fragments of their claims as they tried to refute them. Centuries passed, texts disappeared, interpretations hardened, and the public image of these ideas became distorted through repetition. Then the Nag Hammadi discovery reopened the record, not by solving the mystery, but by giving historians more primary material to compare. But the record shows modern retellings often skip that complexity and flatten many schools into one dramatic script. That flattening matters, because once every source is merged, viewers can no longer tell what was actually written, what was later commentary, and what is modern invention. Now, what about the so-called glitches, the strange clips, and the moments people say feel too precise to be random? There are documented videos and widely shared claims of visual oddities. But public availability of a clip is not the same as verified evidence of a reality failure. In many cases, ordinary explanations remain possible. Compression artifacts, frame timing, perspective, selective editing, or staged content. That does not mean every strange experience is fake. It means the evidentiary standard must stay high. If the claim is extraordinary, here's the problem. Online storytelling rewards certainty and shock, while real investigation usually moves slower, with ambiguity left on the table. If your goal is truth rather than adrenaline, ambiguity is not a weakness. It is part of the method. That brings us to science, where the mystery is real. Even when internet versions are exaggerated, researchers have made extraordinary progress in physics. But public records also show major open problems, including the unification of quantum frameworks with gravity. The fact that important questions remain unresolved does not prove any spiritual or simulation claim, but it does justify careful curiosity. And that is where this topic becomes useful for us, not as a belief system, but as a lens for examining how humans build meaning from incomplete information. Now, let's test one more common claim against the record, because it appears in many versions of this story. A popular claim says hidden elites or systems feed on human suffering, and that this directly confirms the Demiurge model. What is documented is simpler and still serious. Institutions, platforms, and economic systems can amplify fear, outrage, and dependency. Because those states can be profitable or politically useful, that pattern can feel like a machine feeding on attention. And in a metaphorical sense, many viewers map that experience onto an ancient prison world language. But the record does not confirm a supernatural extraction system, and mixing institutional critique with cosmic certainty usually weakens the case, instead of strengthening it. So the next question is, what can we say with confidence? If we stay evidence first, we can say the Demiurge is a real historical idea. With documented roots in ancient philosophy and Gnostic traditions, we can say those traditions were diverse. And modern summaries often oversimplify what surviving texts contain. We can say modern science still leaves profound questions open about reality, perception, and the foundations of the universe. We can also say none of that by itself verifies a literal prison world cosmology, a hidden overlord, or a proven simulation. But the record shows the enduring power of this idea comes from something very human. The fear that we are seeing only the surface, and the hope that deeper understanding is possible. If there is a lesson here, it is not to replace one certainty with another. It is to get better at separating documents from drama and hypotheses from proof. That's where real investigation begins. And it's also where most viral narratives stop. What remains unresolved is the biggest part of the mystery, not whether a single theory has won. But why? Across centuries and languages, people keep returning to the same question about reality and illusion. Documented texts give us the history. Modern research gives us constraints. And the unanswered gap between them is where the mystery still lives. If you want more evidence-first mysteries with real records, unresolved gaps, and careful theory breakdowns, subscribe, because that's exactly what we do here. Next file, we'll follow a case where official reports, witness timelines, and later retellings stopped matching, and the contradiction is still sitting in the public record.